Picture this. It's September 1978. There's a massive storm building right off the Atlantic coast. And over in Midtown Manhattan, this towering 59-story skyscraper stands completely silent against the wind. It's brand new, literally less than a year old, and it's already an absolute icon of the New York skyline. But deep inside its steel skeleton, something is terribly wrong. Imagine being the engineer who designed it, sitting alone in your office. You've just finished running a new calculation. You set down your pencil, and it hits you. This building has a 1 in 16 chance of collapsing. Not in 100 years, not in some freak millennium event, this year, maybe even from this very storm. And thousands of people work inside it every single day. You pick up the phone and your hand is literally shaking.
A 1 in 16 chance. I mean, those are unimaginable stakes, right? This is the story of how one tiny, seemingly harmless change, one completely ignored detail, almost brought down an entire skyscraper, and how one man's agonizing decision ultimately saved Manhattan. So let's just dive right into this explainer.
Section 1. The chevron skeleton. A genius, unforgiving design. Now, to really grasp the fatal flaw here, we first have to understand the sheer genius of the building itself. You probably know it as the Citicorp Center. Today, it goes by 601 Lexington Avenue. Back when it opened its doors in 1977, this thing was the 7th tallest building on Earth. But what made it special wasn't just its height. It was weird. The entire 59-story tower basically stood on 4 massive columns. But they weren't at the corners, like literally every other skyscraper you've ever seen. They were planted right in the dead center of each side. Why? All because of a tiny Lutheran church on the same plot of land that completely refused to sell its corner. So the architects just built around it. They hoisted the entire tower 9 stories up into the air on these giant stilts just to clear the church roof. It was bold, it was super elegant, and architecture magazines absolutely hated it.
But here's the catch. To make that incredibly strange design actually stand up, the structural engineer, a brilliant guy named William Lemaitre, couldn't use normal corner columns. Having the supports in the center is structurally unstable all on its own, so his workaround was this hidden system of diagonal steel braces. They were shaped like chevrons, kind of like a stack of giant letter V's, running all the way up through the building's core, totally hidden away behind the office walls. Now, these braces had to do 2 massive jobs at the exact same time. Job 1, defeat gravity. They had to carry half the building's massive vertical weight straight down to those 4 stilts. Job 2, resist the wind. See, in a normal skyscraper, keeping the building up and keeping it from blowing over are handled by completely different systems. But here, every single brace was doing double duty. It was incredibly efficient, sure, but man, was it unforgiving. Because if just one part of that system gave out, you didn't just have a wind problem on your hands, you had a gravity problem too.
Section 2. One fatal change. The power of the mundane. So how on earth does an architectural masterpiece turn into a ticking time bomb? Well, this wasn't some glaring, stupid mistake. It's actually a chilling look at how totally reasonable, everyday decisions can stack up into a total catastrophe. During construction, a single quiet change was made. Paperwork was shuffled around, a substitution was proposed, and it got rubber-stamped. Lemaitre himself didn't personally review it or even know about it at the time. It was just treated as a totally routine, cost-saving move, the exact kind of thing engineers sign off on every single day without a second thought.
Let's break down the actual mechanics of what they changed. Lemaitrè's original, picture-perfect design called for welded joints. Welding literally fuses steel beams together into one solid, unbreakable piece. It's incredibly strong, but yeah, it's slow, and it costs a lot of money. So the contractor came back and said, hey, what if we use bolted joints instead? They're way faster, way cheaper, super common practice, and totally legal under the building code. But here is the massive critical detail. Bolted joints and welded joints do not handle stress the same way. Bolted connections are way more sensitive to changes in tensile force, that pulling apart force, than welded ones. Almost overnight, the entire skeleton of this massive tower became uniquely vulnerable, and literally nobody realized it.
Now you might be thinking, come on, didn't they test the wind? Oh, they absolutely did. And if the wind was blowing straight on, the calculations were perfect. Building codes back in the 70s only forced engineers to calculate for perpendicular wind. That's wind hitting the flat face of the building dead center. That was the standard worst-case scenario everybody planned for. Almost every skyscraper in America was built to that exact standard, and it was the only calculation the New York City Code strictly required. So they ran the straight-on wind tests, the building passed with flying colors, and everyone went home thinking it was 100% safe.
But here's the thing about weather. Wind doesn't always hit you nicely straight on, does it? Sometimes it comes at a sharp diagonal angle. Engineers actually call this a quartering wind, which just means wind hitting the corner of the building instead of the flat face. Now for your average skyscraper, who cares? If it can survive direct wind, it can brush off a diagonal wind no problem, because direct wind is almost always the heavier blow. But, as we've established, the Citicorp Center was definitely not your average skyscraper. In June of 1978, about a year after the doors opened, an undergrad architectural student was actually studying the building for a college project. And he asked a seemingly innocent question. Hey, how does this structure actually hold up against quartering winds? Word of that question actually made its way back to Le Maizière. And since he was gearing up to give a big lecture on his design anyway, he figured, you know what, I'll just run the numbers and find out.
What he found on that notepad literally stopped him cold. The math was absolutely terrifying. He realized that when wind slammed into those corners at a diagonal, the force on half of the chevron braces completely dropped to zero. But on the other half, the force spiked by 40%. Now, the heavy steel beams themselves, they were totally fine. They could take it. But remember those cheaper, bolted joints we talked about? That 40% jump in wind force more than doubled the physical load trying to rip those bolts apart. And a storm strong enough to snap those bolts wasn't some mythical once-in-a-century hurricane. It was the exact kind of storm New York City gets every 16 years. And trust me, the nightmare gets so much worse. Le Maizière ran the math to see exactly where the skeleton would break first. It turned out the weakest, most overstressed bolted joints were sitting right around the 13th floor. Think about how terrifyingly low that is. If the joint snapped way down there, it wouldn't just be localized damage. It would unleash this catastrophic domino effect cascade, ripping upward through every single floor above it, completely pancaking the entire 59-story tower straight down into the absolutely packed streets of Midtown Manhattan.
Talk about an agonizing dilemma, right? Le Maizière was staring down two terrible options. Option A, just keep his mouth shut. Honestly, the flaw was buried in such insanely dense math that there was practically zero chance anyone else would ever spot it. He could just roll the dice, pray a massive hurricane didn't hit, and completely protect his firm, his reputation, and his entire legacy. Or, option B, speak up. He could blow the whistle on his own masterpiece, risk total professional ruin, and spark massive citywide panic. Well, he chose to speak. He immediately picked up the phone, called his professional liability insurer to get an independent review rolling, and prepared to notify the city. With hurricane season quite literally right on their doorstep, they had to move insanely fast and totally off the radar. Citicorp simply could not afford a massive panic. So they kicked off this frantic, completely clandestine repair operation. Le Maizière figured out that if they could just weld these massive thick steel plates over the top of those 200 weak bolted connections, the building would be saved. And luckily, all those braces were completely hidden behind regular office drywall. So here was the routine. At 5 p.m., after everyone went home, secret night crews would swarm in. They'd tear down the drywall, weld these massive plates in absolute secrecy until 4 a.m., and then frantically clean up. By the time 8 a.m. rolled around and the regular office workers showed up with their coffee, the walls looked completely normal. Nobody had a clue their office was desperately being stitched together around them.
But here's the terrifying reality. Heavy welding takes a lot of time, and the clock was ticking down. What if a hurricane actually hit before the welders could finish the job? Behind closed doors, the city's Office of Emergency Management was sweating bullets. They quietly mapped out an unprecedented 15-block evacuation radius right in the absolute heart of Manhattan. They secretly briefed 2,000 Red Cross volunteers and had them ready to mobilize on a dime. They were pulling 3 weather forecasts a day, and they actually strapped electronic strain gauges directly to the building's skeleton to monitor the stress levels 24/7. For weeks, the biggest city in America was secretly standing on a knife's edge of a mega disaster.
Section 3. A Legacy of Redundancy. Changing the skyline forever. After 3 incredibly grueling months of night shifts, the $12 million retrofit was finally done. The tower that once had a horrifying 1 in 16 chance of crashing down could now easily shrug off a 700-year megastorm. And get this entire massive crisis stayed a complete total secret from the general public for almost 2 decades. It wasn't until a magazine investigation dug it up in 1995 that the world actually found out. But behind the scenes in the engineering world, it changed everything. Suddenly, quartering wind loads became absolute mandatory standard code. Lead engineers were forced to personally double-check even the most routine-looking substitutions. And the core concept of structural redundancy, the idea that you absolutely never rely on a single system without a robust backup, that became the fundamental law of modern architecture. There's this really chilling phrase you'll hear engineers say sometimes: safety codes are written in blood. Basically, it means that almost every strict safety rule we have today only exists because somewhere in the past a fatal flaw slipped right through the cracks and tragedy forced us to learn from it. But the Citicorp Center, it's this phenomenally rare, incredibly lucky exception to that rule. The blood was never spilled. A catastrophic failure that would have changed American history was stopped with mere weeks to spare. And all because a college kid asked a great question and one engineer had the guts to tell the truth.
Which brings us to a final thought I really want to leave you with today. If a 59-story skyscraper sitting in the absolute middle of Manhattan could hide a fatal flaw from some of the greatest engineers on the planet, what other hidden flaws are currently holding our world together right now? What invisible threads are we all relying on every single day without even realizing it? If you love diving into these fascinating hidden mechanisms and high-stakes decisions that completely shape our world, make sure to subscribe to this explainer. Because next time, we're going to uncover another system you use literally every single day that works in ways you never ever imagined. See you then!